terrible audio and video quality? Do you like dizzy, nauseating feelings and epileptic seizures? Welcome to Jacoby's Rants. I'm Jacoby, and this is my rant, and today I'm talking about Stranger Things Season 2, and how it compares with Stranger Things Season 1. As you can see here, I have a whiteboard with some stuff written down. It's ready to go, and I'm just going to talk about it because Stranger Things is infected with a virus, okay? It's infected. And you know what happens when there's an infection, okay? It festers, and then it rots. And that's a Stranger Things reference for you. And the infection specifically that Stranger Things has is what I like to call Heroes Season 2 syndrome. For anyone who's watched Heroes, you may, if you agree with with a common opinion about that, you're gonna know exactly what I'm talking about when it comes to Heroes Season 1 versus Heroes Season 2. We are watching the exact same thing happen with Stranger Things, and I'm gonna talk about that. So let's look at the whiteboard. Isn't this like, check out this awesome quality. Look at this. This is like amazing. So we're looking at the board. So let's talk about the differences for a second. So Stranger Things Season 1 was tight and it was precise. It knew exactly what it wanted to do. Stranger Things Season 2 is messy and it's a little baffling. Okay, so Season 1 of Stranger Things, full spoilers by the way, I'll be unpacking everything basically. Season 1 of Stranger Things was very specific. It knew exactly what it wanted to do. On the one hand, it was an homage. It was an homage to 80s films, but in the same genre. Think Goonies and E.T. and stuff like that. That's kind of what you're looking at. So it's about that, but it's also about a group of kids who are they're Dungeons and Dragons players, and they use the things that they've learned and the sense of camaraderie that they have with playing in Dungeons and Dragons. They take that and they use it to take on a foe, a supernatural entity, like an interdimensional alien. They apply what they would to those situations in Dungeons and Dragons to the situation with the alien. And their bond grows as team members, and it's great. It's awesome. They defeat the interdimensional alien creature with the power of friendship, and it's amazing. The thing about Season 2 is that it's not as focused at all. And it does the same thing that Season 2 of Heroes does, which is this. Okay, now that we've established all the characters, we've laid the foundation for these characters, and we got the viewers to get invested in them. So what do we do now? Let's introduce more characters, and that's what it comes down to. Instead of basically, now that they've laid the foundation, instead of developing continuity and taking the characters to new places, instead they start to introduce new characters, and they do this to the detriment of the main plot. Now, in one of the first scenes of the first season of Stranger Things, you had the scene where they're playing Dungeons and Dragons, and this is an important scene because it is foreshadowing. Why is it foreshadowing? Because they're playing Dungeons and Dragons and they're facing a monster, and Will has a bad roll. He has a bad roll of the dice, and the monster ends up wiping Will out. This is important because this is foreshadowing, because Will is going to get taken by the Demogorgon, or the monster of the season, and the rest of the characters are going to have to figure out how to get him back. Bear in mind that Will is not important as a character. He's not especially interesting. There isn't very much going on with him. He's not developing very much. He is important because of his role in the party. He's a party of the group. The friends care about each other. So when he disappears, they feel a responsibility, just like they would in the game to help him. They feel that in real life. even though the scenario is so much more is really extreme, they relate to it by way of the way that they play Dungeons and Dragons. So, bearing that in mind, let's compare that with another scene, one of the opening scenes in season 2. Not the very first scene. We'll get to that later. I'm talking about the arcade scene. This is the scene that starts off with the people and the party members, the main characters, these kids. They're grabbing their quarters because they're going to take them, and they're going to go to the arcade, and they're going to play Dragon's Lair. And Mike, in a very strange scene, basically sneaks into his sister's room and starts messing around with her underwear until he finds her piggy bank and grabs a bunch of quarters and steals them like a jerk and runs off with them. And that's the first interaction we've seen between him and his sister after the events of the first season, which is kind of odd. But anyway, so they go to the arcade. Why did they go to the arcade? Well, a couple things happen. One of the purposes of this scene is to establish something. It's to establish that Will is having episodes. He's having episodes because of his connection to the villain of the season, which is the Shadow Monster. However, they could have done this in any other place. They didn't have to specifically do this at the arcade. Another thing is foreshadowing. There is some foreshadowing that occurs, but we're going to talk about that a little bit later because that kind of relates to what I'm about to mention. So, in the first season, you had foreshadowing about Will getting taken. In this season, this scene in the arcade where they all come together and they're playing Dragon's Lair is used to foreshadow that Lucas is going to be with a female character named Max. So instead of it being like a major plot point that has to do with the rest of the story and kind of sets the tone for everything, it has nothing to do with the rest of the story for the most part. It has nothing to do with it, which is kind of interesting. So basically, to recap, the entire point of them going to the arcade, of that first scene with them together, is so that they can go there and they can see that a new player has a high score on Dig Dug, which is an arcade game. If you've watched the show, you know what I'm talking about. Also, it's a game that I used to play on my dad's Atari 2600. But anyway, so Dig Dug, she has the highest score, and they see the name. They're like, "Oh wow, Mad Max! Who's Mad Max?" And because that's her name on the arcade. When she gets the top score, she leaves that. So they're trying to figure out who Max is, because Max is amazing. Everybody loves Max. The story has to hype up Max, and spends an entire scene doing this. What is interesting about Max? What makes her interesting as a character, and how is she developing? Over the course of season 2, she doesn't develop really much at all. She's angry, she's frustrated with her brother, and there's a point later on where she stands up to him, but other than that, she doesn't develop as a character. All of this is setting up for stuff that's going to happen later on. And I'm going to kind of get into this later, but the problem with this kind of setup is that it makes sense to the writer, because the writers, in this case probably to an extent the Duffer Brothers, to them it makes sense that these characters are going to be doing some of these things, but to the viewer, we're going to be confused because they're looking ahead and they're like, oh yeah, this makes perfect sense. This character is going to do this because it's going to set up these other things. But to us, it doesn't make any sense at all. So, and I'm going to explain what I mean by that. So, got to keep this moving. Let's talk about Will for a bit. So, Will is a huge, like I mentioned before, he's important for a number of different reasons, for plot reasons in the past season. And once again, he's a major he's a major part of the plot this season. But again, it's not because of anything in particular he's doing. He just happens to be he's kind of like a plot device, okay? And so everyone is always freaking out about Will. And this kind of confuses me because you'd think that people would care that a much stronger character is 11 and that they'd want to spend more time on her. Granted, they do. But most of what the group is going through doesn't have to do with 11. It has to do with Will. For some reason, everybody's calling him Zombie Boy and is freaking out and attacking him and being complete jerks about it because of what happened to him, which doesn't make any sense at all. Like, if a kid went missing and went through a traumatic experience in almost any neighborhood, the response is either maybe to like push him aside, maybe to not treat him as much like a person, like to show some kind of contrast, like something happened there, but to just outright bully this kid who is clearly traumatized and went through some nasty stuff is just a bizarre thing. That doesn't make sense to me at all. Why would people do that in such a small community? I don't know. Maybe I just don't understand it. But we spend a lot of time on Will, not for him to develop as a character, but as a plot device. and that's mostly Mike's job too. So Mike's job for most of the season, like most of the other characters, is to dote upon. Is that the right word? Is that the way you would say it? I also want to say dote after. They're doting upon Will. Everyone's like, "Oh, Will, are you okay? Is everything fine?" The whole season. This is the only thing that Mike has to do. And this is also a problem later on. So most of what Mike's doing is she's upset that 11 is around, but he's also he also is a good friend of Will, and he wants him to get better, and he wants him to get past his traumatic experiences. So that's kind of what's going on with Mike. In the meantime, the continuity is a little bit fuzzy because, like I mentioned, the first scene that you have with him and his sister Nancy, he steals money from her, and that's a thing. So like, I just got distracted by this text that popped up. I'm like, what's going on? Oh, what was I talking about? So Mike steals money. So okay, aside from the other things that Mike's doing, he's stealing money. And he's like committing acts of vandalism, and his parents are upset with him over that. He's doing terrible things, and he's having to face the consequences for them. But he doesn't seem like he doesn't seem to feel a sense of responsibility or a sense that he's doing something wrong. He doesn't seem sorry at all. But it's okay because he really misses 11, I guess. Like, who cares about character development? He really misses 11. And so these are the two things that he does. He's trying to take care of Will, and he misses 11. And he wants to see her again. So where this gets weird is like, he didn't have the best relationship with his sister in the first season, but as with a lot of characters, they developed these bonds, and they grew as people, and they grew closer to each other because of the things that they were facing. And so you'd think you'd see much more of a continuity of that going forward. And that's kind of like, and not just with scenes with Mike and Nancy, but with a lot of characters, I feel like this is a problem. And I think Jonathan is one example. Now, Jonathan, he's not so bad. He doesn't really have anything to do this season, much like Nancy. Nancy makes decisions, but they don't make sense, and I'll get to that in a bit. Nancy's decisions make no sense. I'm like breathing because I'm like pacing, but this is how I do this. This is how I stay focused for some reason. It's a terrible habit, is I like pace, and I kind of just like mull over it. So, and it probably looks terrible too, but whatever, I'm just going to do it this way for now. So Jonathan, you'd think that he'd be a little bit different. He's a closed off kind of guy because he had to, he dropped out of school so that he could take care of Will. Is this the theme at all? So he could take care of Will and his mother. He had to. And so because of that, he's kind of an outcast a little bit. And he's kind of shy. He's not very outgoing. And so you'd think he'd be a little bit more confident. And he is, the way that he interacts with people. There is a bit of a difference in season 2. But you'd think he'd have a certain sense of like confidence and boldness that he didn't have before. Like when you defend the girl you like and like other people you care about from like an interdimensional alien creature that's killing people. Like you'd think that would change your perspective. Yeah, maybe there's some traumatic experiences from that. But it's going to change your perspective. You're going to look at the world a little bit differently. So, but you don't really see that. He seems like kind of a pushover. He never confronts Nancy about the way that she seems to want to develop a relationship with Jonathan, but that she's also like latched onto Steve, and it's like she's going back and forth, but he never like pins her down on it, and it's really awkward. So that's kind of a problem. This is what I'm talking about when I mean a sort of lack of continuity and a lack of progressing the characters into the next season. And working off of the foundation that you've already laid. So, Jonathan. Now let's talk about Nancy for a second. Nancy's plot, and Jonathan kind of ties into this because Jonathan is just kind of her lapdog that follows her around everywhere, does whatever she wants, and doesn't really question her that much. He doesn't have a whole lot of agency on his own as far as I can tell. So, Nancy's feels remorse because of what happened to Barbara. She personally feels responsible, which I think is stupid to an extent. There's no way that she could have known that what happened to Barbara was going to happen. I think there's just like other things that she feels guilty about, and that guilt is associated with Steve because at the time she was with Steve. doing something that she felt guilty about, which she additionally felt guilty about because Barbara ended up being missing because of it, and she feels that maybe she could have stopped it, which I don't think necessarily makes sense, but let's go along with that. So she feels remorse, and her way of alleviating guilt is to take down the lab responsible for the Demogorgon appearing in the first place, which is very odd, especially when she does this even after it is explicitly explained to her that the lab is basically, there is like a rift. There's like a dimensional rift, and there's stuff that's coming in and taking over the dimension, and it's spreading. It's like a product of like the shadow monster trying to get in. And so they're basically keeping it at bay, and they want to keep it a secret because if other people, like if like a foreign military, like a foreign government, or just the wrong people figure out what's happening, they're gonna basically they're going to make their own decisions regarding it. They're going to try to either use it to their advantage or something like that. There's always that kind of a risk. Maybe that it's going to be weaponized. And so they don't want anyone to know. Which makes perfect sense. Because if you try and take down the only people that are keeping this thing from spreading, then you're causing a problem that's worse than what happened to Barb. Right? You're creating a bigger problem, but apparently Nancy doesn't see it that way. The way Nancy sees it is she needs to spin a story, and she does, where she records scientists saying that it was their fault. It was the lab's fault that what happened to Barbara. They record that, and then they take it to someone who then sends it to a bunch of journalists, and it becomes a national story. Not specifically what happened, but that it was the lab's fault what happened to Barbara. Yeah, it's stupid. Not only is it stupid, but it has very little effect on the overall plot of the season. This is probably, like I was saying, they're trying to set up for things that are going to come later at the cost of what's currently happening in the plot. Because she spends a lot of time on this. And meanwhile, while she's over, they drive over to this place where they're talking to this conspiracy expert guy, this theorist. They stay at his place, and they sleep together while they're there. And they're just kind of like, oh, well, I guess we like each other. Like, there's some chemistry or something. I don't necessarily see the chemistry. They were in a traumatizing... I mean, I kind of saw it last season, and they went through some traumatizing experiences together. So I can kind of see it in that context. But I don't understand why she's picking Jonathan over Steve. Maybe I kind of do. Like, I mean... Steve isn't the best guy. He's a likable character, but he's not exactly like the best boyfriend, I would say. But for some reason, she's wanting to pick Jonathan over Steve, but she doesn't tell him that. So like earlier, they get into a fight, and she's drunk, and she says some terrible things, and then doesn't like try to patch it up later or even talk to him. She just goes rogue, just gone. Doesn't talk to him at all, and just goes off and sleeps with Jonathan, which I find to be really unlikable. I think that's a really unlikable trait. Like, I was drunk is not an excuse for doing, for being a complete jerk necessarily, and especially if you're not going to apologize for it. But yeah, it's just like the character isn't progressing. She's not really doing anything, and what she does doesn't affect the rest of the plot that much, even though they spend a lot of time on it. Where are we? 11. Let's talk about 11 for a second. Now, I think most people would agree that 11 is the best part of this show. Mike, to an extent, is like a blank slate. I think he has more agency in the first season, and the way that he relates to 11 is easy to relate to. 11 is an exciting character, and she's the type of person that if you were into the things that Mike is into, like he's a Dungeons & Dragons player, along comes this person with telekinetic abilities, like obviously he's going to be excited and intrigued and interested in this person, and they form a bond together. Everybody kind of forms this bond with 11 because it's an important part of the experiences that they had. But Mike in particular likes her. And what am I saying? So everybody likes 11. And I think people definitely like 11 and Hopper together in this season. 11 and Hopper are the best things about this season. All their scenes together basically work. They push the characters. Hopper is an interesting character because he has deep flaws and those flaws motivate him and drive him and affect the way that he interacts with other people and the decisions he makes. And he's just a great character, and he always works. And 11, even in scenes that are terrible, even in scenes that she should not be in, that don't do anything for the story, 11, I forget the actress's name. It's like Millie Bobby Brown, I believe. She brings this layer of authenticity to the character that kind of helps. It could be worse. It could be worse. There's still a level of authenticity to it. Okay. So what am I talking about with 11? So 11 is cool, but what I don't understand is that, let's go back to Max for a second. So Lucas and Dustin want to bring Max into the group for reasons that are never explained beyond, I guess, like she got a high score, and it's implied that Dustin is into her. So, and where this is weird, I'm totally rabbit trailing here. I'm just going to step back. I'm just taking a step back so that I can kind of set up for what I'm about to say here. So what I was saying about the foreshadowing with the arcade is that, the arcade scene is that when they foreshadowed the Will getting kidnapped in the first episode of season 1, in season 2, they're foreshadowing that Lucas is going to be with Max instead of Dustin, because Dustin's into her and Lucas ends up with her at the end during the snowball, which is in the last episode of the season. Oh, train of thought. So anyway, that's that entire plot, and a lot of the season is spent on that. And so they both really want Max to join the group, but they don't explain why beyond that. Because as a group, they're pretty self-sufficient. They don't need someone else to be in their group. They're good friends. They've bonded together well. They know things other people don't know. Why do they want Max in the group so much? And when they do, how come they basically go behind Mike's back to basically get her to join the quote-unquote party? That's what they call their group of people that hang out together. So they get her to join the party, but Mike's the only one who feels weird about it. Wouldn't the other characters feel weird too? And they don't really touch on this. It doesn't make sense to me, because they have these bonds with 11, and so you'd think that would be something on their minds, but it only seems to bother Mike. And so Mike is a jerk, a complete jerk to Max for no reason, which makes him even more unlikable, on top of the other unlikable traits that he has this season. Good God. So anyway, that brings us to 11, the person that Mike is pining after, that he really wants her to come back. He misses her, and he's deeply sad. He misses her. So 11's progression is weird. It's really weird because, at this point, I feel like it's okay. Like, we get it. Part of what we like about 11, like I said, she's one of the best things about the show, is she's a tortured person, but she pushes through it. And this season is kind of like, okay, like, we get it. She's edgy, and she kills people on impulse. Like, we get it. She has a tortured past. They did some cool things with that. I did kind of like the discovery with the mother. That was pretty cool. But I feel like there's other things you can do with this character to push it forward beyond introducing the new test subjects, which is what they did when with the very first season, which I said I was going to come back. I said I was going to come to it, didn't I? So the very first episode of season 2 is they introduce a test subject, test subject 8, who instead of being telekinetic, she can control like what people sense. I'm assuming it's the senses. Because it's stuff that you can, maybe not touching, but it's stuff that you see, and apparently also stuff that you hear. She can basically put that in people's minds. And she's just with a group of people this is where it gets weird with 11. So she's with this group of people that look like tweaked out drug addicts, and they're just hanging out somewhere, and they go around in a van, and they find people that they don't like, that have hurt them in their lives, and they shoot them in the face. And 11 finds them after she finds her mom and gets hints from her mom, who's like in this comatose state but can still communicate with her. She gets hints with her mom about test subject 8, her quote-unquote sister, and goes and finds her. And when she does, her sister's like, hey, do you want to help us go around, find these people, and shoot them in the face? And 11 says yes. This is a real thing that happens, and she helps them go to kill someone, which is so like cliched and awkward. And it just feels like a bunch of steps back, because the real 11 would never do that. The real 11 would not feel an immediate sense of connection to this person she doesn't even know that she found, and just be like, oh wow, sister, like, and immediately want to like create that bond and be like, oh yeah, I'll totally find this person so you can kill him. Like, it doesn't, I see why they did it, to try and push the plot forward. They wanted to develop her character, but even more than that, they wanted to establish that her father is still alive because of something they're probably going to do in season 3 or 4. This is what I'm saying. Like, they're establishing stuff, and to them it makes sense. But and it's going to like pay off sometime in the future, but at the moment it doesn't make sense. And this is a problem that maybe they're not completely aware of, or weren't aware of at the time. So that's why I have written here 8, as in test subject 8 in company, and why, which is how I feel about it. Like, why did they have to have a little spin-off episode of like a spin-off show where 11 goes around and helps people track down people they don't like and kill them? Why is this a thing? So yeah, and I also have written down here, more is less. Okay, more is less, because in the first season you had the Demogorgon, right? And speaking of which, with precise and tight, you knew exactly what, I totally skipped over this, by the way. So this is toward the top. I wrote ambiguous threat, because in the first season it was tight and precise. They knew exactly what they were doing. First episode, you know exactly what the threat is. There's a monster out there, it's killing people, right? And Will's captured, so he's probably gonna die. Oh no, what are we gonna do? So immediately there's a very real threat, and the threat with the shadow monster is so ambiguous that it takes like half the season for you to even understand exactly what it is. And even then, I wasn't sure just how malevolent of a force this was. Okay, we're back. Don't worry. Yeah, I just ran out of space on my fancy schmancy phone there. What was I talking about? So more is less. So how come? And by the way, speaking of like the shadow monster, so they eventually, you do figure out it's a threat, and then you end up with, in one scene, there's 5 Demogorgons. How come in the first season, one Demogorgon was a huge big deal and had a lot of presence, and it was scary, and you felt legitimately scared for the characters? But then there's 5 Demogorgons, and in a few of the episodes, it's like they're less scary than just the one Demogorgon. Like, I have to admit that the payoff of the last 2 episodes, the payoff of a lot of what was happening, a lot of that was pretty good. But at the same time, it's like if you take, and this ties into everything, because I have no problem with introducing new characters. I love it when new characters come into the mix and they change things, and you end up with a completely different dynamic, and how that makes the characters grow and progress. Like, I enjoy that. I like that. But you have to do it right, and you have to do it without sacrificing the character progression and continuity of other stuff that's going on. So that's just one of the reasons why more can be less. Or what? More is less? Yes, or less is more. Either one. I think you know what I'm getting at here. And so even though you had some scenes, like in the past couple episodes, that paid off really well, because they didn't do the best job of making characters develop and really pushing them. The payoffs at the end, particularly at the snowball, are less impactful. Yeah, Lucas is with Max, but what does that mean for them as characters? What does that mean for them as the way that they're developing? You know, it doesn't really say a whole lot about them, because Max is mostly a non-character, and Lucas, he's a fun character, but the same thing, like, he doesn't develop, he doesn't do anything particularly interesting, even though he's likable. And and the same thing with Mike and 11. Yeah, 11 getting back together with Mike was good at the snowball. But Mike as a character, like him getting back with 11 didn't really do anything for his progression for the season because he didn't have a progression for the season. So, do you see the problem? Yeah, so what else is there to say here? I think we kind of went over it. The first season was tight and precise. The second season, I found it to be messy and pretty baffling, kind of like this video. Hopefully this will make sense to some people. This is just kind of a way of getting my opinion out there. Yeah, so it's really starting to remind me of, I love Stranger Things. It's a great show. And season 2 of Stranger Things, I do think that it's got a bit more going for it than season 2 of Heroes did, but definitely feeling some deja vu. This is definitely very familiar. So, yeah.